What's up guys, it's Parallax Abstraction and this is Retro Flashforward, showcasing gaming's roots in the current generation. I still haven't figured out a name yet for my first impressions of modern games, but Retro Flashforward is actually pretty appropriate for this one, so I'm gonna go with that. So this is BattleStorm, which came out recently on Steam from a tiny little two-person indie developer out of Alabama in the United States called Icy Studios. This is actually their first project. And it's kind of interesting, it's another shmup, which I'm very happy about. I'm glad that there's many new shmups coming out and that they seem to keep giving me review codes. I dig that quite a bit. And it's, they say it's inspired in their sales pitch by 90s classics, which is kind of a generic term because there was a lot of shmups in the 90s and they varied quite a bit, needless to say. But this one, I think, reminds me a lot more of 90s PC shmups, the kind you used to see on DOS machines a lot, and there's a specific reason I say that we're going to get into here. So just giving you kind of a quick overview of their little help section, which gives you the basic ideas, but I'm going to go over all of this. So this game has no story whatsoever. It is purely a score attack title, which is kind of cool. There's 25 levels in it. I've actually played through them all, which maybe should tell you something about what I think of this game. But you unlock them one by one as you finish them, so they don't all start unlocked from the beginning. They all also have their own independent online leaderboard, which is kind of cool. Each level individually has that. So pretty interesting in that respect, and each of these worlds is a different environment, but I'll sort of show you all of these. Let's just start with the first level here, and I'll give you an idea what's going on. Why I say this looks a lot more like a DOS shmup, and that is that because it's kind of slow. Now, there are a couple of different schools of thought when it comes to shmups. Some people really like the sort of manic, fast-paced titles that you tended to see a lot out of Japan. You know, the ones that just, there's a ton of things happening at once and everything moves super fast and it's crazy and it's very much a spectacle, right? And the sort of subset of that is bullet hell shmups, which is sort of a similar idea, except there's a billion bullets on the screen while you're doing it. A lot of, not every PC shmup, but a lot of them, partially for technical limitations and also because of just design reasons due to the fact that a lot of people were playing with a keyboard in those days, tended to be a bit slower paced. So they were still challenging and there was still a lot to do, but it just wasn't manic. It wasn't crazy, right? And that's kind of what you're getting here. This reminds me a lot of games kind of like stuff like Raptor Call of Shadows or even Tyrion, games like that. I really need to do videos on those games at some point. I still haven't yet. But those were shmups I really enjoyed. So if you're a fan of the manic style shmup, the much faster stuff, this is probably not going to set the world on fire for you. I can actually appreciate both. I totally understand people who prefer one kind of game or the other because they definitely do play very differently. But I can actually like both in their own way, and this reminds me a lot of that. And there's actually quite a few systems and mechanics to this that can make it fairly challenging, especially if you're aiming for a high score, and give you a lot of things to think about. So the first thing here is this control scheme, which I actually think is a pretty big innovation that this title has. So before it came out, or not before it came out, but before I started recording, they actually released a patch that they claim makes this control scheme a lot easier and more accessible. I beat all 25 levels on the original control scheme. You can't actually revert this back to the old scheme, and there's a couple of people in their Steam forums that are kind of upset about that. I personally find this new thing better. It's a little tighter, a little bit more responsive. I actually kind of like this. But I didn't mind the old control scheme. The thing with it was that it took a little while to get into, so let me explain what this is. So in most shmups, you use only one stick, and you're controlling the position of your ship, something like this, right? And you're always firing straight ahead. In this game, this plays with a twin stick mentality, or twin stick method, and you're controlling the position of your ship on the screen with the left stick, but then you're controlling your aiming rotation with the right stick. This is kind of different and actually really mixes the formula up quite a bit. Especially on their old control scheme, I actually did find it really frustrating for about the first hour or so. I was having a really hard time figuring it out, and I was dying a lot, and I was kind of like, oh, this friggin' sucks. Why did they do this? Why did they deviate from the shmup formula that everybody knows and loves? But then after a little while, it just clicked, and I was kind of like, yeah, all right, I kind of dig this. I like this freedom of movement. I like the fact that this gives you multiple different ways to attack large groups of enemies, and you could sort of mix your strategies up, which I can appreciate that. So I actually think that's kind of a cool innovation, and it definitely is easier to get into now with the new update. I personally think that was a good idea. So now that boss I took out in about 2 seconds, but that's because we're early on here. So I'm going to show you a level from each of the different environments. Let's back out here. So let's go to World 2. So each of these worlds, like I said, is a different ease in them, but they do get harder. The enemy waves do get much more complicated, and yeah, so this is the sort of snowy environment. There's no reason you're going to these areas other than it's just to mix things up. Like I said, no story in this whatsoever. So, in addition to what I was telling you about the control scheme, there's a lot of variety in this in terms of power-ups and the ways in which you can tackle enemies. So, you're seeing here I'm dropping bombs and shooting my gun. So you fire the gun with the right trigger. This game does work with a keyboard and mouse, but I highly recommend playing it with a controller. I find it's much better that way, and that's what I'm doing. So the right trigger fires your gun. Your gun, you may see in the upper right there, those two little meters. So those meters represent your gun and your shield, and I haven't even talked about the shield yet. I'll get to that. So you fire your gun, and your gun actually recharges. Your gun will never not shoot, but it fires much more rapidly when it's charged up. So a lot of shmup games just encourage you to sort of hold down the fire button for the entire time you're playing. That's not a good way to play this one. You really want to let off the trigger once in a while and let your energy recharge so that you can get that sort of temporary rapid fire. Some of the higher end levels that have more complicated waves of enemies, this is essential. If you don't do that, you're not going to get very far. The bombs, well, so if you hold down the left trigger, you'll see that a reticle appears underneath me, and you'll drop a bomb wherever that's showing. That reticle is fairly closely limited to where your ship is placed, so you've really got to move around the screen a lot to drop the bombs. There are some ground-based enemies like ships and gun turrets that are fairly slow, but they will do damage to you significantly if they hit you, so you do want to try to take them out. And there's a pile of static buildings on the ground as well, which the main purpose of taking those out is to maintain your multiplier, which I just lost right there. So this being a score attack game, maintaining your multiplier is key. Ideally, you want to try to get through a level without ever having your multiplier reset, and you can do that on every level. But it requires you to juggle between taking out the air enemies, the ground enemies, and buildings, and doing them in such a way that there isn't too big a gap between them so that you lose your multiplier. There is a power-up you can pick up that will actually give you a multiplier save. So they're only single use, but they can stack up so that you can actually have your multiplier hit 0, or have the timer hit 0 anyway, and you won't lose it, which is kind of nice. But that's kind of random, which I'll get to. So you really got to mix up your bombs and your shooting in order to do this. Beyond that, you also have missiles, which you can use with the right trigger. So you can see in the upper right there are limited numbers of these things. And these are seeking missiles. So I principally use them on the bosses, but you can use them to also thin out a complicated wave of enemies. Because they're seeking missiles, they're kind of fire and forget. So if you're dealing with a really complicated wave of enemies, you can just fire a few of them off, thin the herd out while you focus on something else. It helps out a lot. There's also a nuke, which I'll show you when I get to the boss. That is basically a screen-clearing weapon, not unlike you would have in a lot of other Japanese shmups. It does a lot of damage to the boss, and it will also clear out other sections. I believe you can pick up more nukes, but they are exceedingly rare. Usually you'll only get one per level, so you do want to be very careful to only use that when it's absolutely necessary. Unlike some other shmups, this game does not give you bonuses for having missiles or nukes left over, so there's no reason to hoard them. You know, it does behoove you to use them when you think it's going to help you out, especially for doing things like maintaining your multiplier and things like that. Alright, so I took that guy out. And at the end of each level, it phones your score home to the leaderboard. It will phone your score home when you die as well, so while you won't get to the top of the leaderboards without finishing a level, you can still place. I don't know if you can see this coming up here, but this just launches the Steam browser and actually gives you the leaderboards in a web-based format. There's a few levels where I am actually at the top of the leaderboards, which, well, shows you this level only has 8 entries. It kind of shows you that, unfortunately, this game does not have much of a community right now, which I kind of hope it does, because, like I said, I am enjoying it. So here we go. Let's go to the third area. All right, here we are. So the last thing is that you have a shield, which you activate by hitting the left bumper, and it has its own charge, just like your gun does. That's the little blue arc in that upper right menu. So the shield not only blocks shots, you have an opportunity as well to actually reflect shots back at enemies with it. That is a mechanic I've had a very hard time doing. It doesn't, I don't know, every time I try it, it doesn't seem to work out that well for me. So I'll be honest with you, I almost never used the shield in my first playthrough of this when I beat all 25 levels. I just found it wasn't necessary most of the time. Now, that said, that's not to say that it's useless. That I wasn't using it means I was probably putting myself at a disadvantage. There probably were a number of times when I was playing where if I had actually used the shield, it would have helped me out. So don't write it off just because I say I didn't use it very much. It probably could be very, very helpful to you. So there's a number of different power-ups you've seen me getting here. Some of them are weapons, some of them are power-ups from my existing weapons. There's additional missiles you can get. There are instant boosts to your multiplier. There's score drops, which your multiplier will affect, which can be really handy. There's score saves. There's a whole pile of stuff, right? There's no extra lives because you do only get one life in this game. You have a health bar in the upper right there, though you can get power-ups that will recharge some or all of your health, as you just saw there. So there's no such thing as extra lives. It's one life per level, but you don't die in one hit, obviously. So there's a wide variety of stuff there that can help you out. So here's two different score power-ups. Now, what some people are going to be bothered about is that these power-ups do drop randomly. A lot of people like in shmups where the power-ups and the enemies that drop them are pre-planned out so that you can actually play the level over multiple times, memorize the pattern, and get your best score by achieving the best pattern. Some of the most famous score attack games like Ikaruga and things like that, are very much based off that concept, though Ikaruga doesn't really have power-ups per se. This is totally random, and you're going to have runs where you will do significantly worse than others simply because the power-ups didn't drop with the frequency that you wanted. Especially in the later levels of the game, I had levels that I failed repeatedly, and then during one of my runs, I happened to get a health refill power-up at a very strategic point, and that made it easier for me. A lot of people are not going to like that. They're going to say that there's too much randomness and that makes the leaderboards unfair. I get that school of thought if that's what you think, but personally, it doesn't. In this game, it doesn't bother me. This is not like Tron Runner, where you can literally spend money to always buy yourself the best power-ups and basically game your way up the leaderboards, even if you're not very skilled. The power-ups are random in this, but I find they generally tend to work out in the wash in the end. The levels are fairly short in this and encourage rapid replay, so it's kind of like something like pinball, where you can have a good run or a bad run, but you can redo a run very quickly, and chances are within 2 or 3 runs you'll get a good mix of power-ups that you really wanted, and that will help you a lot in terms of getting the level of score you want. I don't know, if you're really hardcore pure about that stuff, then you're probably not going to like the fact that this game does have randomized power-ups. For me, in this case, I think randomized power-ups, they have to work in a very specific context, otherwise they're not going to work very well, but in this one, I think it's fine because the levels aren't super long. And I've been doing just fine on the leaderboards regardless, so that's an issue there. So let's pick the next one here. I believe we were on World 3, were we not? Let's try that. So, other complaint that this game looks like it's in 4:3. So, this is actually running in 1080p on this machine, but for whatever reason, the playfield is artificially restricted to this 4:3 looking thing, which is kind of a bummer in a modern title. I don't know why that is. This is the first project from Icy Studios. It's on the Unity engine. And I'm guessing that maybe this was a performance thing. They just couldn't figure out how to optimize this so that they could have the full screen available without it severely hurting performance. I will say this is the first video I'm recording on House, my brand new i7 6700K PC that's heavily overclocked. And this game, even on this behemoth, is taking up almost half my CPU power while I'm playing it. Unity is rather famous for, despite the fact that games made with it frequently don't look state-of-the-art, it still takes up a whopping amount of processing power. That's why Unity games often tend to run like crap on consoles. So that's something to keep in mind if you're going to be trying to play this game on a lower-end PC or a laptop. You may have problems with that. I mean, Steam refunds do allow you to sort of gauge that for yourself, but that may be why they cut the screen off like that. That's a bummer. But for me personally, when I'm playing games like this, I tend to be very focused on the playfield, so I really don't even notice that much that you can't see much the edges of the screen. But yeah, it is cut off like that, and that will probably bug some people. Can't say I blame you, but for me, it doesn't impact things very much. Speaking of graphics, I don't think this game looks bad, but again, it doesn't look state-of-the-art. The enemy designs are fairly limited. There's only a handful of enemies. The bosses are very, very limited, and that's kind of a disappointment. The bosses are where a lot of shmups really tend to show off their artistic chops and tend to make things that look really weird and different. Not with this one. The bosses are all... It looks like it was almost designed to be modular, where they sort of took a generic model and then just repurposed it to fit different guns on it. The bosses are slightly different shapes, and they do have different gun placements, especially in the later levels, but they all look pretty much the same, and that's kind of a bummer. But really, the draw of this game is the mechanics of getting the score attack, and the art doesn't... I've seen games that look way worse than this, for sure. The sounds are also kind of muted and underwhelming, and the soundtrack, while it's got some decent action tunes in it, and it does sound sort of 90-ish, there aren't many songs, and they do kind of repeat. It will kind of get grate on you, I think, a little bit after a while, but this game does have independent music and sound effects sliders, so if the music gets old for you, you can just turn it down and play your own stuff if you want, which I do appreciate as well. So, that stuff is okay. You know, the mouse and keyboard controls in this game, they're doable. You can totally play it like this, but I would say you are at a pretty significant disadvantage if you're not playing with a controller, so I would highly recommend that. Though maybe if you put enough time into doing it with mouse and keyboard, you can get just as good, if not better, at that. So hey, that's going to be a your mileage may vary type deal. And yeah, you are playing 25 levels of really variations on a theme. Like I said, that the environments change and look nice, but they have very little impact on anything. The enemies are all these sort of generic models that just don't stand out in any way, things like that. But I still am enjoying this quite a bit. Here's the thing about this game. It's $5. I've paid way more than $5 for games I liked way less than this. I finished all the levels before I sat down to record, and I've actually been having a pretty good time with it and doing really well in the score attack sense. You know, some of that might be because obviously this game doesn't have very big leaderboards on these kinds of games. But I like those DOS-era shmups, and this is the kind of game that is going to sit in the desktop fence that I have, which is for games that I don't play all the time. But when I either don't have a lot of time or the mental capacity to really sit down and invest in a big, heavy, story-driven game or a AAA title or something like that, where I can just be like, yeah, I'll just fire this up, I'll do a couple of quick score attacks, and then that'll be it. And I'll come back and poke at it once in a while, you know what I mean? I have a bunch of games like that, and that's where shmups tend to sit for me. I like shmups a lot, but I'm just not good enough to get into them super hardcore. So they're a nice little casual diversion for me, and this suits that very well, I think. And for a first-time project, for $5, I think there's a lot of value here. It can take 2 to 3 hours to beat all 25 levels your first time through. I don't like the sort of dollar to hour ratio. I think that's a poor metric, but it is nonetheless one that's very common these days, so maybe that's not bad for you, but 2 to 3 hours for $5 is a pretty good deal. I mean, you know, a lot of these story-driven indie games that are coming out these days are way shorter than that and cost way more, so hey. You know, it's down to personal taste, obviously. If this was $10 or more, I might be like, with these production values and this lacking content, maybe it's not worth it. But for $5, I think you can't go wrong, for sure, if you're into this kind of thing. I've actually been having a lot of fun with this, and I've been enjoying coming back to it. So, but what you see is what you get here. It is a slower-paced shmup that does rely a lot on RNG and is about score attack more than story or even really flashy presentation. It has some shortcomings, especially when it comes to screen real estate and enemy variety and things like that. But there's something quite compelling about this to me. And I've just been sitting down and really enjoying it. And the levels are short enough that you can go through several at a time in rapid iteration. You know, you can just click continue at the end of a level. You don't even have to go back to the menu. It'll just jump you right into the next one. Things like that I appreciate. And they actually put in a good amount of weapon variety in here, and there's a good way to, there are a number of different ways to approach it. And the control scheme, while maybe not for everybody, I think is actually fairly innovative and something a little bit different in terms of this kind of shmup title. So I enjoy it quite a bit. And if you're into shmups and you do want a good little slower paced one and just want to support the cause so that we keep getting more indie shmups, which is something I really want to see, I would highly recommend this. For, again, $5 of your regional equivalent, you can't freaking go wrong with it. So, and I've been having a good time. So yeah, that is BattleStorm, developed by Icy Studios and released in 2016 for the PC on Steam. It's good for what it is. If it was much more than $5, I might be like, I'm not so sure. But if you like this sort of slower paced shmup, this is a great deal and a good first effort. I hope Icy Studios does get to make some more stuff. My name is Parallax Abstraction. Thank you all very much for watching. If you like what you saw here, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. That does help me out a great deal. And well, I will see you guys next time. Take it easy, everybody.